All right, let's get started. Welcome to the MIT Mobility Forum. This is the session 166, where we'll focus on the state of the Canadian transit system. I'm Jinhua Zhao, professor of system transportation at MIT, who's host of this panel today. So let me give some context here. Somehow, Canada is the envy of the U.S. transit agencies. We interact with people from Chicago, Los Angeles. They all say, wow, what's happening in Canada? So many things going on there, right? They also, I had the privilege of living in Vancouver for 3 years there. I do feel Canada is just nicer in many ways, right? Give you one example. I was talking to a city planner in the city of Vancouver. We talked about sustainable development. I said, what's the difference? He said, Jinhua, in Vancouver, we do not need to convince our local citizens that we need to do sustainable development. We just need to tell people how to do it, right? That's a very different narrative in many of the cities in the US or many regions there. The other thing is, though, despite this impression, our understanding of Canada is actually very shallow, I would say. Many of us don't really understand the nuances of the cities and of specifically the transit operation. For example, there's often an impression that Canada is a vast country with few people. But in fact, in terms of urban density, Canadian cities are in general much denser. This of the top 10 densest city in North America, actually, Canada has 6 of them between US and Canada on that, right? So today is really my joy to have 3 transit leaders in the industry to come join us, share their experience. I will invite each of them to say a few words about themselves to begin with. Jeff, please.
Yeah, thanks for having me. 30-second introduction. Jeff Busby, I'm the Chief Operating Officer at TransLink, where I've worked for 16 years. I guess an early career highlight for me was sharing a desk with Jinhua as an intern at the Chicago Transit Authority, which is another way of saying that I'm a graduate of the MIT Transportation Program. I guess important maybe context for some of our remarks today, a dual citizen. So I was born in the US and now live here in Canada. Josh, over to you.
Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Jeff. Nice to be here with everyone. Josh Cole from the Toronto Transit Commission, based obviously in Toronto, Canada. It's the 3rd largest transit system in North America. And my role is as Chief Strategy and Customer Experience Officer. It seems to be ever changing, and we can talk about that more in my presentation, but I'm happy to be here with you all. And, just to reinforce, as Canadians, we of course love all Americans. And despite, obviously some of the interesting dynamics happening between our 2 countries, but lots to learn from each other.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, David?
Good afternoon. My name is David Cooper, Principal Lead in Mobility Consulting. I've spent 14 years in government working for the transit agencies. Worked with Jeff at TransLink, worked at the City of Toronto, and as well as the City of Calgary, and then been a consultant for the last 7 years. My interest is in infrastructure, policy, and transit safety. So I've actually been doing some work on the state side on this, and excited to have a conversation, not just about our differences, but our shared objectives and things that we are navigating together. So as much as we're neighbors, we have a lot of things that we also need to rely on each other, and a lot of that's happening in the transit space. So happy to have that conversation today.
Wonderful. So before I do the second round, I want to remind the audience that there's a norm I want to enforce at this forum. That is, everybody contribute one idea, either as a comment or as a question to the panelists today. You can type them directly into the chat along the way, and we'll curate them past for the panel. Right. So second round, I invite each of the speaker to give a 30-second take-home message. So we'll start with Jeff again. Yes.
Yeah. So I'm going to be faster than 30 seconds. I think the key thing that I want to convey is that service levels are what really matters and what drives transit demand. And I'm hoping I can lay that out both from a kind of nationwide perspective and from our approach at TransLink.
Wonderful. Thank you. Josh?
I'll say, we all have different levels of progress and success, and I'll hopefully share some of both our challenges and successes so everyone can learn from it. I guess my one big takeaway is I really believe and try to preach about embracing radical incrementalism. And I think that's an approach that, as people who support mobility and transit, we need to not think is a bad thing, and there's much good that comes from it. So we'll speak to a bit of that.
Nice. Radical incrementalism. Thank you. David.
I've been spending a lot of time working with five of your largest agencies in the States in the last couple of years, and including up to even recently a month ago. And I think the shared space of interest from, my role is on the transit safety file with some of the social complexities that we're having on our agencies is no different from our side of the border versus
Yeah.
yours. And how do we build kind of the partnerships and support and how do we navigate this together is huge. But there's also shared space for us on maximizing benefits from housing and transit. We fund transit very differently, but how do we, the one thing that is very top of mind is how do we build that kind of broad coalition politically from the left and right into some of these transit investments, and that's a shared space that we also have as well, and keen to kind of learn and see that from our American friends and share kind of what we've seen on that from our side of the border. So differences yet similarities.
Nice. Thank you. Yeah. So for Jeff, not only agreed to attend today's session, actually helped me design the session. So thank you, Jeff. I'll give you the first 8 minutes.
Sure. Thanks. All right. Well, good morning, everybody from the west coast of Canada. I'm here in Vancouver, a region that has just under 3 million people. So I know this forum attracts an international audience, and so I apologize if I'm directing a lot of my comparisons to the United States. But if you combined the United States and Canada, Vancouver would be the 25th largest metropolitan region. Yet we have the third busiest rail system and the fourth busiest bus system on the continent. And I want to reflect on that in two ways. I'll share with you first kind of my case for why I think it's important to consider Canada as a kind of policy example, and then give you some examples of how we're applying some of these lessons directly here at TransLink. So why Canada? So I'll just start by observing that we are profoundly influenced by our proximity to the United States. Incredibly integrated economy, lots of policy dialogue that occurs across the border. From an urban structure perspective, if you were to, for example, stand in the post-war suburb of Denver, Colorado, where I grew up, and look around, and then look around a post-war suburb of Calgary or Vancouver or Toronto, you would see much more similarities than you would comparing the same experience in Europe or East Asia or the global South. Like our cities, in many ways, resemble each other. And yet, despite all of this similarity, the transport outcomes are actually quite different. Canadians own fewer cars, they drive fewer kilometers, and they use transit quite a bit more. And so it's a bit of a natural experiment. It's an imperfect one, but it's worth asking. So why? And here's the answer. I'll just come right out. First of all, we have lower GDP per capita, which is a polite way of saying we are a poorer country. That helps explain why we own fewer automobiles. Our gasoline prices are much higher, much, much higher than in the United States, which explains in part why there's less driving. Our cities, as you've heard from Genoa, first of all, Canada is a large country. It is also an incredibly urbanized country. We're one of the most urbanized countries on the planet. Our cities are dense, much denser than the United States. And important, our employment concentration in our cities is also much higher. And so I think that goes a long way to explaining the differences in outcomes. You'll notice none of those things have anything to do with choices that transit agencies make directly. And so the one other area that transit agencies across Canada have made a different choice than in the United States is their approach to how they used subsidies when they were introduced largely started in the 1970s. And the key difference is that a lot of the additional resources available to transit went into the provision of transit service. And so as a result, by the 1990s, the level of service in Canada per capita was 40% greater than in the United States. And as a result, ridership was 100% greater than in the United States on a per capita basis. Our fares are also higher. And so for those of you who work in transit policy space and are worried about affordability, I think one of the things to consider is whether low-income people would benefit from more transit service more than perhaps a lower fare. For this audience, I want to be transparent. My sources for what I've just told you, my source actually is a 30-year-old paper by Paul Shimmick, an MIT alum, And he compares directly the United States and Canada in terms of their transport outcomes. I very much wish that I did not have to cite a 30-year-old paper and had more recent data. I am a practitioner, so I didn't have time to spend a lot of time checking to make sure that all of this is still accurate 30 years on. But what I can say using 2024 data is that a lot of these same findings from 30 years ago apply to this day. And just to give you a concrete example, if you take boardings in a metropolitan region and you divide it by the metropolitan population, you can really see the stark differences in outcomes. As Jinhua mentioned, 6 of the top 10 cities in terms of urban density are in Canada. 4 of the top 5 cities in terms of ridership per capita are Canadian cities. And they're not just the dense ones like Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. Calgary is actually the 5th. And Calgary is a city that, on its surface looks very much like my hometown of Denver. So just to put that in numbers, in Metro Vancouver, we have 153 boardings per capita per year. I looked this up. Boston, Massachusetts is 1/3. 54 boardings per capita, despite what I would consider very favorable conditions for transit success. So what does that mean for us at TransLink? By the way, I'm breaking a Canadian stereotype of not bragging a little bit. So I wanted to acknowledge that, first of all. What does that mean for TransLink? I want to reflect on a couple of things that I think set us apart and is certainly a focus for my organization. The first is building on this finding around service. If you only know one fact about the transit system in Metro Vancouver, it's probably our SkyTrain system, the automated system that offers really tremendous benefits in terms of frequency, all-day frequency. I could probably spend a whole hour talking about the benefits of automated metro systems. What I actually want to focus on is the work that we've been doing on our bus system. Metro Vancouver has an incredibly extensive bus network. We serve 85% of the residents who live within our region, despite it being quite large and having some quite remote areas. I think a more important statistic, though, is that 45% of the residents of Metro Vancouver live within walking distance of a frequent bus service. That is frequent all day from early in the morning until late at night. Our definition is a service that comes every 15 minutes or better. And where we have had additional resources to invest in service, we have really focused on expanding the extent and the intensity of that frequent network. And that's really paid off in terms of ridership and benefits. You can go on our website and there are mini maps to download or interactive maps. Most of those are oriented towards the users or potential users of our system. There is a particular map, though, that is not intended for users of our system. It is our frequent transit network map. That is a map that we publish with the explicit intention of influencing regional and city planning, land use planning, and hopefully influencing development. It's now become practice, regardless of modes, to think about concentrating development near frequent transit. And I think that's an important thing to reflect on. We have our SkyTrain system, but it can only serve a small fraction of the region. And in terms of driving the development outcomes that we're looking for, concentrating that around frequent transit, regardless of mode, really, really important. Second thing I want to spend a little time talking about that I'm quite proud of is, if you're going to provide high levels of service and have it operated frequently, it's going to be expensive. And so one of the things we're doing is trying to ensure that we maintain the cost effectiveness of our service, primarily through working in partnership with road authorities around bus speed and reliability. It's one thing to have a bus coming every 15 minutes, but if it's getting slowed down in traffic, that is a cost that is coming back directly to our agency, and then of course indirectly to the users who are having service that's running slower and slower over time. Our approach at TransLink is to have a comprehensive program around preserving and improving bus speed and reliability. It's very data driven. We do a lot of work to publish both person minutes and vehicle minutes of delay across corridors. We have quantified that. We actually estimate that we spend $80 million a year, or about 15% of our budget on bus service is spent on services that are, it's essentially money that is spent on time that is lost to traffic congestion. And so we've put together a program of about $5 to $7 million a year worth of annual investment to essentially claw back that time. And where do we spend that money? We spend that money on obviously monitoring, on studies, on staff support, not just for our own staff, but staff at the road authorities, where they can do work to identify transit improvements that range the gamut from just signage and policy changes, all the way up to big projects around bus priority lanes, and work that we do on our end around stop consolidation. This is a program that is definitely evolving, and our intention is that program expand into more ambitious areas, including transit signal priorities, automated lane enforcement, and bus rapid transit. Those are not present in our region at the moment, but they're a big focus to us, both because they drive really good customer outcomes, but really importantly, they drive really important financial outcomes for the sustainability of our service. I'll touch briefly on our efforts around decarbonization. Obviously, the policy rationale around climate action is well understood, I'm sure, by this audience, and it's really solid. I think there's also a financial case around electrifying our bus services, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, where we have really abundant hydroelectric power and it's quite affordable. I firmly believe that as we transition towards battery electric buses, we will see operations and maintenance savings costs through lower energy costs. The challenge we're encountering, and I should say that financial rationale also explains why we have more than 250 buses already running on trolley overhead lines and have been running since the 1950s. It's just really affordable to run vehicles by electric power in the Pacific Northwest, as opposed to using Alberta's oil to fuel our vehicles. I would say that this is an area that is a challenge for us at TransLink, and I think it's shared across the industry. One of the challenges around deploying battery electric buses at scale, kind of scaling up from pilots to full deployment, is that it is a real systems challenge. It requires new vehicles, new infrastructure, new operations technology, new information technology, and all of those four things have to converge and come together. Just to give you some insights into the challenge that presents for us as an authority, those four different things are delivered in our historic model by four different departments across two different companies. And so when they all have to work together and maintain high levels of reliability, that has been a challenge for us to organize. The other challenge we're navigating is the vehicle supply industry. And this has been a big challenge around, and we've seen this, that Canada and the US kind of share a vehicle supply industry for buses. So our bus market is quite small in Canada. And one of the things we've done, this also is urgent work because of the trade-related challenges we're having right now, and supply chain challenges. One of the things we've done is work really hard at TransLink through a concerted effort to diversify our vehicle supply chain. So we've just signed a contract with Solaris, which is a Polish bus manufacturers to buy our next generation of trolley buses. These are buses that will be manufactured in the European Union and imported into Canada. That contract was signed before the trade disputes started, but just underscores really the importance of diversification of supply in that area. The last challenge around electrification is the constraints that it puts on our already stretched depots and the demands for service expansion. And so I think one of the things that we are thinking about really deeply at TransLink, and I suspect other agencies are thinking about, is, given that we already have pretty low carbon intensity per vehicle kilometer, and we have high utilization of the buses, is the electrification of the fleet the key driver around climate action, or can we achieve some of those similar goals, perhaps continuing to rely on internal combustion engines through expanded service provision? And this is a tension that we are actively navigating in our organization right now. And then the last thing I'll talk briefly about, because you can't have a talk about transit without talking about funding, is our revenue sources. So TransLink, our fiscal framework, which is set out in legislation for us, requires us to have a 10-year plan that is fully funded on both capital and operating. We do get to revisit that plan on a 3-year cycle. And this fiscal framework, I would argue, is really sound public policy. It requires us to ensure that we have a sustainable approach to how we're delivering our services. And we were able to successfully meet that fiscal framework until March of 2020. And after March of 2020, that fiscal framework has essentially we've been unable to meet the test of producing plans that are fully funded over 10 years. We've become increasingly reliant on short-term, originally emergency transfers from the provincial government, and now direct ongoing financial support. And if you read our current fiscal plan, even though we are actively expanding service and growing the size of the transit network, in order to meet the test of a fully funded 10-year plan, there are actually large assumed service reductions happening in those outer years. And there is an increasingly urgent need to address our fiscal framework. Ultimately, these are political decisions, and so David will speak on some of the work that we're doing across the country to build the political coalition around continuing to invest in transit. The one thing I would offer is that I think at the kind of TransLink management level, we've tried to take a really principled approach about how to think about how to fund transit in proportion, or at least in representation of the benefits of the transit system. So we recognize that obviously the direct beneficiaries of the provision of transit services are the transit users. We collect revenues from the transit users directly in the form of fares. Road users also benefit from transit through congestion relief, and we collect at TransLink directly revenues from road users through a fuel levy. Property owners benefit from transit through the increased accessibility of different properties, through the development opportunities that are unlocked. We collect revenues from property owners in the form of property taxes. The piece that is missing in our puzzle, which actually is present in a lot of the U.S. systems, is that the economy, businesses, transactions also benefit from the agglomeration that occurs as a result of the provision of transit service. That is a missing piece for TransLink in terms of where its revenues are coming from the global economic activity that we help contribute to. That oftentimes takes the form of a sales tax in the U.S. context. I know we have an imprecise and measure of that, or I should say source of that in our framework through these transfers that are coming from senior government. But those are not currently, the way they're structured, they are not ongoing, and so we can't continue them. My last comment on funding is that on our road user fees, we are Transit collects directly a levy on fuel. I was going to do the math to convert it to US dollars, and then the morning got away from me. But I would imagine it's about 50 cents per gallon, if not more. It's quite significant coming directly to TransLink. And that revenue source is declining and should be declining given efficiencies on the road and policy objectives around vehicle electrification. British Columbia has the highest penetration of electric vehicles on the continent. And so while we very much support those policy objectives, it is undermining our revenues there. And so that's one of the areas that we're focusing our work on, working with our provincial government and regional partners to identify how to eventually replace that as a key pillar for our revenues. So I'll stop there and
great. Thank you so much, Jeff. This is wonderful coverage there. One thing you mentioned about the comparison with US, China is 30 years old. This forum happened to be also a class at MIT. So any of the student you want to update that comparison, let me know. I know Jeff probably work with you to do a modernized version of that. And also, Jeff, really appreciate the point about service level is the fundamental here, right? Particularly between better service versus lower price, we better have a better service, right? Let's have the equilibrium at the higher level rather than lower everything down to that, right? Also on the climate effort, is that just one quick question. I noticed that Canada opened the market to BYD on the electric cars, if not wrong. Can you guys buy electric buses from Yutong or BYD or Chinese producers?
This will be an interesting conversation with Josh because Canada is a big automotive industry nationally, primarily in the East. And so in the West Coast here, where the automotive industry isn't strong, we do not have Buy Canadian requirements. And in fact, many of our trade agreements prohibit us from favoring Canadian suppliers. And so we could purchase buses from China. When we did our last bus procurement, it was open to anyone, and that's how we resulted in this Solaris contract. This is the first entry, to my knowledge, of a European manufacturer into the North American battery electric bus market. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Josh. Please, for the Toronto experience.
Thanks for that. And I guess we'll move a few thousand kilometers east to Toronto, where the TTC really is in, like many of you are seeing in your homes, in this really kind of intense period of change and transformation, right? Both in the work we do and kind of the conditions under which we operate. And so just want to highlight a bit on that and set the context. So we have over 2 million boardings a day across a subway, streetcar, bus network. So probably a fleet of almost 2,000 buses. Almost over 90% of the city is within a short walk of our 10-minute or better network. So our service standards are really robust. It's the backbone of what we do, as much as people focus on rail. It's the workhorse of I think all of our systems. And we have over 250 streetcars now in the downtown core mostly. We have 2 subway lines, but more on that to come, that provide a lot of our ridership. And so all that to say, what are we experiencing right now, and what are a lot of kind of the systems our age experiencing? So it's this confluence of we in the Greater Toronto area, which is going to be a region that's approaching 7 million people. We've had a rapid growth, right? Intense growth, where we'd have all those kind of bragging stats of like more cranes in Toronto than all U.S. cities combined over a long period, which was true, right? But with that, it's put intense pressure on how we deliver transit and our infrastructure, and of course on housing prices and all those other associated issues. So we're a region and a city that's experienced rapid growth after a period of no transit buildup for a long time. On top of that, as you all know, so many other shifts that are happening. So we have mobility patterns post-pandemic, but even before that, right, are completely shifting. We look back at documents where we're giving old strategic plans that are not that old, where like rideshare did not exist. Remote work was kind of like a futuristic kind of concept, and it's all here. And what we're recognizing in this period of change is that the way people move and use transit, it's not just like a pre and post pandemic thing anymore, right? It's shifted fundamentally. And I think we are catching up to that, but we're not there, right? The industry isn't, and certainly in Toronto, it's something where we're trying to recalibrate how we plan, how we cooperate and partner, how we communicate to our customers. The other piece that's just such a massive shift that I don't think we talk enough about is customer expectations have completely changed, right? I feel like the transit industry for generations was largely engineers who were kind of moving widgets, right? It just happened to be human beings on buses. And I often use this reference in this joke. I have 3 sons, and my youngest, who's 16, cannot fathom a service that he could not procure while lying in his bed on his phone. Yet the transit industry is still stuck in this world in many cases of, very analog, in person, lining up, all those types of things, right? So we've got that, that's industry-wide has happened. And while I know TransLink is doing some really cool things in that area, and many other systems we see and borrow from are not at the pace at which customers have changed, right? And so the third piece is, because we're a legacy system, I'll touch on some of the new things we've done. We've got some systems that are aging out. We actually decommissioned an elevated rapid transit line recently, and our post-war subway lines that are at 50 and 70 years old now require a ton of work and investment. And the dollars that are flowing in Canada typically are for new and expansion lines, not for legacy. So the context we're operating in, I know this sounds really familiar to a lot of you, but we've got this convergence of rapid growth we can't keep up with. We've got aging infrastructure and customer expectations that have completely changed, right? And a shift with those shifting mobility patterns that come with it. So as an agency, it's an exciting time, but one where we really are having to pivot quickly and challenge a lot of the traditional norms and orthodoxies around transit planning and transit service delivery that have held tight for so long. And so I like that, and I think it's a good thing, but it's not something I don't think that any of us naturally are comfortable with, or that the industry really has a long history of. And so I think conversations like this, and the more we trade and swap and steal ideas, the better. So kind of setting that context of where we're at, in this part of the world, the piece I want to kind of flip to a little bit is that, and why I mentioned radical incrementalism, is we're actually seeing progress. So despite all of this kind of challenge and opportunity, we're seeing progress. So in the last 3 months, I've had the pleasure of opening 2 rapid transit lines, 2 light rail transit lines. One a $3.5 billion project, the other one, they say 15 billion, but I don't think we'll ever know till there's probably like an investigation and audit. 15 years in the making, as old as that youngest son I referenced. So long awaited. And Toronto has a history of debating expansion projects. We love it. We love debating mode, technology, routing. Lots of crayons and lines on napkins is almost like a civic pursuit. And the other, so we finally opened 2, 2 in a short period, and some have some teething pains, but it's a real sign of progress, right? And we're thrilled for it. At the same time, we are in the midst of extending 2 subway lines and building what we'll call a new metro line, somewhere between LRT and subway, that will really be transformative for the city. So really great, kind of progress to kind of speak about there. The other thing when I talk about, mention progress is our ridership, while it has changed, the pattern and the kind of has shifted, I think fundamentally, our ridership is back. People are taking transit again, right? So it's softer in certain areas and certain times, and it's grown more on weekends and evenings than it was before. But we've had a return of ridership, which is great, right? So again, that's it, with our kind of funding model that Jeff touched on. The fare box for us is still about covers half of our operations, right? And so ridership is essential, and it's a constant political pressure and question, because to our overseers, it means you're paying the bills. So how are you growing ridership? So we are super focused on reframing and recalibrating our ridership growth efforts to get to the next level with all that change and shift I described earlier. So, we've got all this great expansion, wonderful. Ridership's coming back and we want to grow it. But where I see the most opportunity, and why I kind of mentioned that radical incrementalism, is what we've seen in Toronto. So expansion projects are great. They're billions and decades, generational. But, some red paint on some asphalt is profoundly transformational at a fraction of the cost and the timeline. And so while it still comes with political fights, and we've just been through some here, the immediate impact is so tangible. And so we had one corridor down by our waterfront. We had a new college campus that was built out there. Congestion was growing. Just so happened, right? Just kind of almost like a legacy fluke of road design. We had an unused shoulder lane that we were able to transform that into a priority transit lane. The performance results immediately are unbelievable. And it shows people that we don't necessarily have to have these holy wars over like subway versus LRT. Are you going to fund the entire network plan or not? That if there's some political will and you can take these little steps and show progress, it gives you so much more license. And the example I'll give is with that little win, and it's just a kilometer. What we've been able to advance now is rapid transit lanes under the guise that we're hosting the World Cup, some matches along with Vancouver and other North American cities, but using that as a bit of a driver for action to identify 2 other corridors, one a streetcar one and one a bus one, where again, it is just a priority transit scheme where we've removed some parking, we've put on some left turning prohibitions, made some other changes in terms of stop rationalization, and immediately we're starting to see the benefits, and the project's not finished yet, right? When on Reddit where we have a bus route called Dufferin Street that's affectionately known as the Suffering Dufferin route. And when you see the most jaded customers posting on Reddit their trip as they fly by cars and congestion, I will always love to be at a ribbon cutting, and we're so pleased that there's that capital investment and expansion. But those little interventions are so powerful, and I'm really trying to pivot our approach to that. And I would say those are even bigger ones, even things as simple as signal priority initiatives, which we're doing right now, where one intersection, transit gets priority, a queue jump lane that allows a bus to kind of move a little bit quicker. Really focusing on some of those efforts now and our work around signal priority that's really starting to build momentum. And I hope and I think that will give us license for more investment, more stakeholder buy-in, and then hopefully the bigger stuff will follow too. So if I think about what's next in our market and maybe what's next for a lot of us, I think the first thing is that Jeff touched on this, the basics matter, right? At the end of the day, and I know David's going to touch on this, what do people want in a public transit, right? They want it to be fast. They want it to be safe. Reliability can be measured in a ton of different ways, but there's not a lot more than that. And I know I'm diminishing how hard it is to achieve those things, but I really believe we're at a moment in time where that doubling down on the basics to grow ridership, to prove our worth is more important than ever. And so any measure that we can take, whether it's operated performance, whether it's the way the road is planned or regulated, to squeeze that bit of performance out, it pays dividends in every single measure. And so something that we're really redoubling our efforts on, and I think that's what a lot of our next little while will look like. The other one I would say that the fact is we need to collectively transform our funding model. It's just not sustainable. And whether you're in a growth market or one that's not, it can't just be the fare box. It certainly can't just be property tax. That's basically our other. It has to be something that's tied to to income and to business activity, and so we will continue to push on that. But the one thing I will kind of look back on is I firmly believe, I've been around this now for kind of a lot more years than I'd like to admit. You're only going to get, the big capital expansion project. You're only going to get a nudge on how you transform the financial sustainability of funding transit if we are having these quick wins, these tangible improvements. And so what does that mean? It means better service. It means it appears to be safer. And I know David could talk a lot about that. And it actually is, especially for the rider who hasn't been with us for 5 years. And at the end of the day, it's just a faster trip. And so it sounds so obvious. But I really think we've got this opportunity and this moment of change. And Toronto, I'm sure our changes has a different profile and tenor than other places, but the industry is changing so much. I think the opportunity now is that as we string together these wins, they really will start to tip the scales in terms of how we bring back ridership, how we expand our networks, but most fundamentally, how we transform how we're funded. So a bit of a view from Toronto.
Thank you so much, Josh. I think you have two different roles. One is chief strategy officer, the other one chief customer officer. I really glad to see in your narrative, really you channel the two together, focusing on how do you really stand from the customer view, changing the more the impression of what transit could look like on this, right? Also appreciate this radical incrementalism. Maybe because we have short of time, we'll move to David for the third one. I will also have Brandon give a comment. But let me pose a question to all panelists for you to think about. That is, in America, despite all the good intentions, we care about all these social objectives. It's just we couldn't get things done, right? Where's our project here, right? Somehow in Toronto, things get done. I mean, many good projects in Vancouver, etc. Anything three of you can share with the experience, that would be great to the audience. But let me leave it to the after David and the comments on that. Thank you, Josh. Yeah, David, please.
Yeah, so I think what I'll do is I'll start more so on kind of the differences, and Josh and Jeff speak to the operating funding model, which is a critical issue for all of us across Canada. We've had some pretty significant differences when it comes to capital. We don't have a national transit strategy in Canada. We don't have a federal transit administration that does oversight or funding, but we do have increasing interest from provincial and the federal government in terms of funding these big ticket capital projects, but we're having a hard time convincing them on the operating. We had a missing generation of transit projects, and Josh alluded to that. One of the things that's been really exciting is we've seen increased federal government interest in some of these economic infrastructure projects, I like to call them, in terms of these big, light rail transit projects or metro projects. We had one of the biggest openings in Canadian transit history in Toronto last weekend that a lot of us were at. So we're starting to see the benefits of these overall projects. We don't do sales tax referendums, which are very popular in the States. There was one exception of that in Metro Vancouver when they were looking at a different revenue total for capital, but the direct investment has been very different from us. But we're starting to see a conversation from the federal government for sustained permanent funding, but we just don't have that kind of role and that oversight from the federal government, which sometimes is a positive and sometimes is negative, depending how you look at it. One of the things that excites me about working in transit is that we are a solution to several different crises that are happening at any given time in society. We have a housing crisis in Canada when it comes to housing affordability and supply of housing. We've had a cost of living and affordability crisis. We have a climate crisis, and transit's at this really interesting center point of being a solution to that. And it doesn't matter if you're really on the left or the right. There's a lot of support for transit, and I think there's a lot of desire for the leadership of our sector to really demonstrate our ability to deliver on outcomes in these particular spaces. And I think the ingredients are there, and us delivering on those is pretty significant. We've had a lot of regulatory changes from the provinces and the federal government in terms of what they want to see for maximizing the benefits of housing and transit. We've seen a lot of movement on this in states like California and Massachusetts, but we're starting to see this here in Canada. In our new public transit fund, which we're waiting to roll out from the federal government, there's a series of housing conditions that they have been. What's been interesting is there's a lot of hesitancy at a local level to do some pretty, I think, sweeping land use planning reforms. I'm a land use planner that does transit, so it's been interesting to watch this. So through different funding programs, we've seen federal interest help to move the dial on some of these conversations when it comes to densification and infill in some of our cities. And we're going to start seeing that with some of the transit funding. They have interest in intensification on transit corridors so that we maximize the ridership and housing investments on these corridors, different forms of housing, parking minimums. One of the things that is starting to rear its head, and there's a significant nervousness of agencies and government to talk about this, which I think is actually to our own peril, frankly, is displacement. We've had a lot of projects come online with a lot of impacts in communities. And this is not just a Toronto and Vancouver problem now. The federal government has made it a housing condition to start addressing displacement from a residential perspective. I think we need to start looking at it from a commercial perspective. But how do we make sure we're not pricing out the communities that we're building transit to? And I think, I did a national report on this with one of our universities here in Toronto, and this is an issue happening in Edmonton. This is an issue happening with a lot of our projects across the country. And how do we make sure that we, keep communities whole in the ways that they can benefit from having these infrastructure projects? The other thing that I'd say is a a pretty shared space is I was the co-principal investigator for the TCRP Impacts and Response to Drug Use on Transit report that came out last summer. I was very fortunate to work with the transit agencies in Portland, Denver, LA, Chicago, and Philadelphia in person and got immense amount of support with them on this particular topic area, as long as they're partners. And what was very eye-opening to me working on societal complexity on transit that we're seeing in Canada is it's almost identical, the same story in the States. And when our oversight panel said, find 5 case studies where there is outreach programs or enforcement approaches and things like that, they said, find 5 North American agencies. And we actually asked to do 1 Canadian one, and we got declined. And the reason why we were declined to do a Canadian agency as part of that report is there was this notion that because we have a publicly funded healthcare system, that we have things figured out when it comes to more crisis intervention on transit, and that is just not the case. We have significant gaps when it comes to the back end supports that we need to help people that are coming to transit. We've had a lot of agencies that have built out and done a really good work with an empathetic lens on mental health supports, on supporting those who are sheltering in place on transit, harm reduction, substance use supports. We've done a lot of work on dealing with potentially the acute issue at that moment in time, potentially for the person, but which I would call tier 1, but tier 2, which is the back end support to get people in transitional housing, to get people into recovery infrastructure, harm reduction, mental health support is just very limited and sometimes not there. If you're in crisis on transit for mental health, the gap is so big in both sides of the border, frankly, that you could drive a bus through it. It's really bad. And I think a lot of work that needs to be done on that, and happy to have a broader conversation. We did a 12 agency conference on this with agencies from Canada, the US, and Denver a month ago. And this is something that I think sustained efforts would be. And I know Jeff and Josh have oversight on some of these pieces as part of their respective remits and their organizations. And one of the things that is a challenge is also just the perception of safety when people come back to transit, and we see a lot more complexity occurring amongst our customer base, or things that are occurring kind of as a spillover effect on that. How does that impact the perceptions of those who want to come back to transit, to those who are using transit, and those who are working in transit? And those are pretty big issues that are actually pretty universal on both sides of the border. And with that, I'll turn it back to the broader panel.
Great. Thank you so much, David. So Brandon, 2 minutes remarks. Thank you.
Three panelists have all explained lots of different things. A few things I want to identify with the limited time here. First, I perceive Canada, as in many things, somewhere halfway between Europe and the US. It shares some things like in Europe, such as a greater sensitivity to sustainability, greater sensitivity to land use, but not to the extent in Europe, but more so than in the US. That means that for what Jeff talked about in terms of causes of why transit works better in Canada, he forgot to mention there was no interstate highway system. In fact, in Vancouver, there are no superhighways at all. There's no GI Bill. There was no overt policies encouraging suburbanization, but yet we still have a lot of suburbs, but we have denser cities that weren't destroyed by the interstate highway system. But the dense cities are not like European ancient, historic cities that are very dense. The other thing that is very different in Canada than in both US and Europe is that the nature of the policy framework here, where there's federation there's a federal government, provincial governments, municipalities with distinct areas of responsibilities. So in Canada, one talks about cities being creatures of the province. So that means that all the decisions are made by the provinces in terms of urban transportation, and then the responsibilities are conveyed to the municipalities. What that means, they've given monopoly of transit to municipalities, but that means they're also responsible for the budgets and the deficits. And with the exception of Vancouver and Montreal, there is no tradition at all of earmark taxes that support anything transit, water. Like in the US, there's all sorts of different sales taxes, payroll taxes that support transit. In Canada, the prime source of revenue outside of the fare box are property taxes, municipalities' property taxes. So it is incredibly constrained. But it also means that all the oversight, policy oversight, is by municipal politicians. There is no independent regional authorities. There are no independent authorities like in Europe. It's the vast majority, with three exceptions, are all, and even in Toronto, TTC basically, even though it has a commission, is underneath the city of Toronto. So they're very constrained. They have a 2-year horizon on their re-elections. So they're very practical, very nuts and bolts, and want to see it work because people complain directly to councillors, and councillors want the systems to make things work. That's the pro. The con is they're very risk averse. So it is incredibly hard to innovate, to invest in technology, to take risks, because there is such a tight relationship between transit, what happens there, and what happens in the media and what happens in the press. So those are, I think, important things that distinguish Canada. In terms of the future, lots of different issues came up. Drug crisis, homelessness, security and safety is going to be an issue. Housing, David mentioned that. I guess because of COVID, there was a lot more emphasis on equity. And so it's raising some of these other societal issues that transit has to deal with. But I have a dilemma, and I think it's actually universal for, it's more acute here because there's more sensitivity than in the US. But I see a conflict between focusing on equity on the one hand and sustainability. Because to be honest, the only thing we're doing, and pretty universally, is to invest in electric buses. And yet that is very minor impact compared to getting people out of their cars onto transit. And the things Josh talked about in terms of incrementalism and so forth are really, really critical for that. People are more sensitive to service and reliability, but also the image and the whole that gets back into the whole issue of homelessness and so forth. So how are we going to tackle this, this contradiction? We don't have a strategic vision in general because everybody's municipal politicians with every, 2-year horizons. How do we deal with these conflicts between equity on the one hand, social service sort of perspective, and being a sustainability, which has to be attracting choice riders. And they're difficult balancing act that I think is going to run into the whole funding issue as well, because we're in a new world after COVID. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, thank you, Brendan. So we have very short time. Jeff, when we designed the session, everything great. I think we should have designed 2 sessions for this such rich conversations here, right? Yeah. So if people don't mind, we may run 5 minutes later than typical. We end at 1:05. I have some short question. We invite John for some question there, right? I will pose 3 questions together to the panel. You pick each one, any one of them. I have a short answer, like within 1 minute. The first one is how do we get a project done? Second one is, Jeff, you mentioned in the abstract about the immigrants' impact here, right? This is sharp contrast to US. US historically, with one of the very rare occasions, our population growth stagnated. No more growth on this because immigration. While in Canada, we have a lot of immigration, right? You can, from one side, raise the demand on housing, on transit, but also provide labor. You don't have as much labor shortage, for example, right? The third one is, I think, John, you hinted at this. There's a foundational shift in terms of the geopolitics between US and Canada there, right? Besides the impact on the trade, on military or diplomacy, what's the concrete impact on the cities and the transit? It would be great to hear some comment on that. Very short answer from each of you, and then John for another 5 minutes for the Q&A from the audience. Jeff, do you want to start? And Josh, okay, go ahead.
I'll take a stab at one. So I think what happens is we love planning projects. We love the shiny. We love big, multi-year, and that work always has to be done. There has to be some intentionality, though, in shifting and translating that message into immediate improvements and in language that people understand. And so what I've found has happened historically in this market is often the weight and burden of the big, ambitious long-term plan, which we're all told and we what to do, that weight crushes the ability to do something more immediate. And so whether you want to call it a pilot, whether you want to use the World Cup or a special event that's coming to your town, if you want to use the pandemic or a crisis, I think there's real wisdom in doing that because that gives you the license and then the buy-in on the bigger stuff. So I just think I've been burned enough times. I've got the scars to prove it. And so embrace that and work with your communicators and your strategists and your government relations people and all those and make sure that they're in lockstep with your engineers and your planners to make sure that you can get those wins and show the progress.
Nice. Thank you, Josh. Jeff?
Yeah, your question is the kind of contribution of the immigration policies towards cities and the transit system. I mean, I think just for context, Canada has 40 million people. In 2024, there were 1 million people that moved to Canada, and of course, I'm an immigrant to Canada, and I think this is a country of immigrants, and there's been a long-standing consensus nationally around the benefits that come from newcomers to Canada. We are like candidly, we're seeing this change. The federal government took some pretty radical steps to reform and constrain forms of immigration in the last year. And that showed up immediately in terms of what we saw here at TransLink. Newcomers to Canada oftentimes come as students. Those are high transit users, disproportionately work in service and warehousing distribution jobs. Those are the types of jobs that are heavily users of the transit system. And so as when we saw those federal government policies change on immigration and the type of immigration that was occurring, we saw ridership respond quite quickly, and I suspect that's something that I am actually know that my colleagues are seeing that across Canada. I think the underlying strength though is that the Canadian government now more than ever is really focused on national policies around improving our economic performance. And to David's point, we are trying to position transit and investments in surface transportation in cities as part of a broader economic development agenda around the agglomeration economies, around connecting people to work. And so I think it's a real privilege to work in public service in a place where you can have those sort of direct impacts on these kind of broader issues, which, I think if you saw our Prime Minister's speech in Davos, like this is the mantra for Canada going forward.
Great. Thank you so much. David?
I'm going to speak to the delivery question, building off of what Josh said, but also illustrate it with a Vancouver and Toronto example I lived myself. So in Vancouver, there was a period of 7 or 8 years where there was no transit expansion. The Olympics happened, Canada Line opened, and then there was basically a freeze for about 6 years, with the exception of Evergreen. And there was a big push to do an investment plan, which is a really smart way of doing business, and people should look into that. And one of the things TransLink said was, okay, we will address the critical overcrowding. Fortunately, there was 100 buses that were there that we could pull. And there was a quick win of flooding the system with these 100 buses to deal with overcrowding. So what did that do? The investment plan said we need to increase taxation to put this additional service. People benefited from the service. They delivered on the outcome. Then they were able to say, okay, boom, let's go after the big stuff now. And they were able to get that political win to do that. And, King Street Pilot would be another really good example of that in Toronto. The piece in Toronto that I think we need on delivery, and Josh and I have talked about this at length, is governance. When I worked at Toronto City Hall, there was an MOU that no one would sign between the city and the province on who was responsible for rapid transit planning. And it caused lots of issues. And we used to joke on my floor, like transit planning was like etch a sketch. We'd draw it and then we'd just shake it. And which was also demoralizing, to be honest, as someone who had to like live it. And it was demoralizing to the city. And When you do that, you increase risk on projects, you build distrust in the public, and you don't deliver. And having that clarity of governance of who's ultimately responsible, who's going to deliver on this, and how we're going to work together is vitally important. I think we're in a better space on that. Is there always room to improve? Absolutely. Is it going to be some teething pains on this? Absolutely. But we need to clarify who's responsible and accountable for this and go towards the same North Star. I think we're in a better place in Toronto for that. There's a lot of heavy lifting. I'm going to credit Josh for actually a lot of that because he's wore several hats on that. But that is vitally important. Like that MOU drove us crazy, frankly. But that's now not an issue.
Great. Thank you, David. John.
Okay, so as always, very active chat. I'm just going to try to concentrate down to three questions which really apply across Canada. So the first question was Hung Yu Zhao asking about the spiraling cost of transit projects. What can be done about that? Do you think that really is a core issue? Second question was from Joe Delorto, and also John Cardos asked about the Canadian experience with public-private partnerships, particularly in transit agencies that operate across multiple jurisdictions. And then finally, Jim Quisenberry asked about integration of micro-mobility solutions with public transit agencies. That's a lot to cover. Jinwa, I'm going to turn this back to you, actually, because I have an interview for the
Sure, of course.
project
Yeah, you go
that I
ahead.
need to
Yeah,
jump on.
right. Yeah, so
thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, Josh, and David. Pick any of the three questions, just one, focus on it, a 30-second response.
Yeah, my 30-second answer on transit costs is this is absolutely a real issue, and it's something that I think we really need to tackle. I know there's some good research that's coming out of NYU that's really influenced work in New York. We were just talking about a paper that was done at the University of Toronto that looked at this, and I think if there are researchers on the call, this is an area that is really ripe for understanding what's driving and motivating these costs. I've spent much of my career in project development, project delivery, and never have I had the experience of projects that are coming in at multiples over what we internally think they should be costing. So this is a priority for our industry.
Maybe I'll use it as a segue to the P3 question.
Yeah.
So we're kind of having a moment of reckoning in Toronto because the two lines I mentioned that we're thrilled to open, but really struggled, and we did not experience the risk transfer, the benefit of risk transfer. We did not experience the benefits of delivery, kind of schedules being met, and we didn't meet the benefits of costs being contained. And so whether fair enough to land at the feet of the model, the delivery model, one that in Ontario for sure, where we're based, and Canada in general has been a huge proponent of over the last couple of decades. It's having its moment now where it's going to be quite the referendum on the model. And so I'd watch this market with interest if that's an area of focus for you.
Nice. Yeah, David?
Briefly on this, we're going to lose the public and political confidence if we don't get this under control on the cost side, and it's a massive problem. People throw around the term inquiry. I'm not a fan of that, to be honest, but I really think our funders from the provinces and the federal government need to actually put the hammer down and say we need to have a commission or some sort of look into this to send a market signal saying, hey, we're not going to be going out to market on these things unless we start getting some of this under control. And there's obviously variable and fixed costs that have degrees of control, obviously, but we need from the top to put the hammer down on getting into some of these root issues because it's just not sustainable. Like these projects are being built off of credit. Like if you really want to start looking into things and we need to demonstrate the public, people want to see the value and benefit of it, but it's going to kill us to actually get these projects advancing if we keep coming back with headlines saying things are on multipliers more when we need to get into the broader conversation of really rooting down, and it's the funders that have to force it.
Very quick. Jeff, part of the problem with P3s is that there's no transparency the way the Canadians have done it. So it's very, very difficult to do research about what the
Yeah.
underlying causes are.
It's all commercially sensitive. Yes.
It's all hidden. And so we're going to have a really hard time sorting out the root causes of things and what the actual costs of things were.
Yeah.
Good. All right. So sorry to run 8 minutes over time. Please join me thank David, Josh, and Jeff for this brilliant discussion and also bring this conversation. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks for having us.